Hi everyone, Anthony Fantano here, the internet's busiest music nerd, and it's time for another edition of the YUNOREVIEW, where I go over a bunch of records that I didn't have time to do a formal review of, gauntlet style. And yeah, you probably have seen an episode of this before, you know what you're getting into, so let's not even tease it any further, let's just get into it. Let's go! I saw a lot of buzz floating around this album, and of course with it being labeled as like this Ethiopian jazz revivalist type record, my interest was piqued, but actually listening to it, I don't know, I like the aesthetic and I like the vibe of the record. The instrumentation sounds like really raw and organic, the recording, maybe inadvertently so, sounds kind of psychedelic, but the performances, in my opinion, are just like a little rough, not quite as tight or together as I would like them to be. Often it kind of takes away from the performance and the groove aspect of the songs, but still, if that's not something that disappoints you all that much, if that's not a huge factor for you, I highly recommend this because, I mean, in timbre and style alone, there aren't a lot of records like this that I've heard this year, so I would say give it a shot, out of pure morbid curiosity. Unfortunately, this new Denmark VESSEY project just kind of left me scratching my head. I mean, his previous efforts have felt a little bit more fleshed out and together and sensible, in my opinion. Even that By Mooey Drugs attempt at doing like an industrial hip-hop thing, which, while it didn't connect with me, it still was pretty listenable, and I saw the hype. I got why people liked it so much. This, however, just kind of feels like a handful of tracks which have been mixed by Earl Sweatshirt, mixed by Knowledge, and then after these tracks kind of blow through, many of which are sort of super lo-fi, kind of jazzy, kind of difficult to describe because they feel so nondescript. He's come out with such bolder music in the past before, and then he follows this up with like a really weird, short, heavily sample-based beat tape that just kind of goes a few minutes. And I don't know, as a listening experience, it's not very fulfilling. It's just kind of okay. Maybe just kind of a thing to hold the fans over before he has something bigger coming down the pipe, I hope, but meh. How many projects deep are we with Tinashe, and she's still yet to deliver a sound and a style that feels like it's uniquely her? Like, for the most part, with the exception of a few tracks here and there that sound super, super poppy and trendy, a lot of the cuts on here are just super slow, moody, artsy R&B, just kind of generic. There's so many other artists making this sound right now, doing it better, doing it with more flair, more style, better lyricism, more interesting production. It just sort of feels like she's still at this point behind the curve in terms of songwriting, in terms of vocals, in terms of production. It's just kind of disappointing yet again because she successfully presents herself as being bolder than she actually is. This new PROF album I was pretty curious about given some of the teaser tracks to it, and I've enjoyed some of his music videos in the past. I mean, he's a really zany, out there character. I mean, if you love a lot of Eminem's earlier stuff where he's just totally off the fucking rails and he's off the wall and it's really cartoonish, like, you'll most likely get into PROF's music. And this newest record over here is no exception, although there is a bit of a change in sound this time around. I feel like he works with his singing voice a bit more on this record, which is kind of a double-edged sword because it adds a lot of personality to this record. It adds a lot of silliness, a lot of tongue-in-cheek attitude to this album, but yet I can only take so much of his singing because it's not like it's that great. So beyond that, we have a lot of heavier, bangier, trap-style production, which he's clearly just trying to keep up with the Joneses, and much of it isn't really all that bad. You know, it kind of keeps the viscera of the album high. One of the few things about it that's consistently great, that and his energy on the mic, but I feel like there's a bit of a drop in lyricism on this record. He also puts out some bars that you can tell he's trying to be funny, but they're just kind of warranting eye rolls for me personally, like this one line when he's talking about being the shit and needing a diaper and so on and so forth. The album is a little lengthy and bloated too, you know, as somebody who's like this, like on the fucking edge all the time, I can only take so much of it. But still, there's some good performances on here, some decent song topics, some decent production as well. It's not a bad record. If you like your rap music a little animated and eccentric, then it's probably worth trying out. And shout out to Rhymesayers for putting it out. Yeah, I didn't really expect too much out of this project because I thought the teaser tracks were just okay. They just kind of sounded like structureless, generic bangers that you could find on a number of SoundCloud profiles, and lo and behold, that's in fact what it was. Some of the features come in and kind of bring the energy of these tracks up, but for the most part, the songs on here are just like really aggressive, really short, not a whole lot to them. They catch kind of a vibe, they have a hype, they have an energy to them, but there's not a lot to it beyond that. I feel like with this project, you could kind of get what it's delivering on a lot of different records, on a lot of different mixtapes, on a lot of different internet profiles. You know, it's not really bringing anything as significant as like Smokepurpp's Dead Star project not too long ago. So yeah, I mean, it's okay. Just kind of feel like we're painting ourselves in a corner a little bit. No, I'm not listening to the new Sting and Shaggy. I'm not gonna do that. No! Shout out to this all-girl Spanish garage pop and punk band. Their new record is out and it is full of fun vibes, full of attitude. If you're kind of looking for a summery, carefree rock record, I highly recommend it. However, for me, what kind of takes away from the album is that the lo-fi production seems like it didn't need to really be as lo-fi as it is. Primarily, the distortion in the recording comes from just like the really fuzzed out, super volume boosted vocals, which I feel like with better mixing could have just sounded good, could have been more fun, could have been less abrasive. While I don't mind abrasive music, it just sort of seems like something that just didn't really need to be as harsh on the ears as it actually is. It's fun or it's interesting for a song or two, but for the length of an entire record, even with this being as short as it is a bit of a nuisance. That, and I guess their songwriting isn't really that diverse, but still, again, if you're looking for a record that you can just kind of zone out to, have some fun to, put on at a party, you're out, cook out, sun's out, guns out, that sort of shit, out with your friends, then pop it on, give it a listen. It's worth a shot. As conceptual as Elevators 1 and 2 might be, and as topical and narrative-based as some of the tracks on here may be, yet again I feel underwhelmed by a Bishop album, and that mostly has to do with just, again, his delivery and his vocal style. There's just not a whole lot of flavor, there's not a whole lot of spice to it. I mean, sure, he has a baseline of talent, he has flow, he can spin a yarn, but beyond that, I just feel like the beats on here are super bland. His performances are just very so-so, very run-of-the-mill, very jazz rap runoff. It feels like he's just kind of borrowing from a lot of the more underground hip-hop artists of the 2000s, the whole Stones Throw thing and beyond, and just kind of, I don't know, breakdancing on its grave. I'm not trying to be mean to the guy, but it just feels like he could be doing more with it than he actually is. Next, this new Jack Ladder album. Jack is a songwriter, he's a guitarist. I've seen him play live with the one and the only Alex Cameron, whose album Forced Witness last year was one of my favorites. So of course, given that connection, I really wanted to try out his newest record over here, and I liked some of the teaser tracks to it. And it's not a bad singer-songwriter record. It's very slow, it's kind of despondent, it's moody, or at least that's the vibe it gives off, especially in Jack's very deep, husky, pronounced vocal style. Seems like very, very, very Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds influence, but it's not quite as aggressive or off the wall or anything like that. Think of the more mellow side of the band's spectrum. Aside from that influence kind of being worn on Jack's sleeve, the only thing that really kind of holds this record back for me is just that I feel like some of the performances in the instrumentation, occasionally in his voice, just feel a little stiff, a little awkward, kind of like he could be adding a bit of drama or something to what he's doing. Despite a lot of these songs seeming kind of dark, there just isn't a whole lot of emotion translating for me because, again, it just seems like the performances are a little sterile. Even though I wasn't super crazy about the last Black Moth Super Rainbow album, which came out a long time ago at this point, I still kind of went into this thing with high hopes because typically Tobacco's solo stuff is pretty decent, but still I kind of feel like he's continuing to use this project to just dive into the same lo-fi, super psychedelic beats with the whispery lead vocals there's just not a whole lot to the band's sound at this point that isn't just a played out gimmick. I know that sounds harsh, but I really do truly feel like BMSR is in dire need of some kind of revamp or revitalization. I mean, at this point, I feel like I look forward more to Tobacco albums because at least there, I know that he's going to change things up a little bit, try something different, get a little bit more experimental. But outside of this album sounding maybe a bit more mellow and ambient in comparison with other Black Moth Super Rainbow records, there's not a whole lot to report. I mean, I would say even with this change, it's a bit of a downturn in a way because with things on here sounding so dreamy and formless, the songs really do kind of lose any sense of structure or like even a pulse. So I mean, if you're kind of looking for something that sounds sort of like psychedelic, very dreamy, kind of bubblegum, sort of sweet, but isn't demanding that you pay too much focused attention to it, then I guess give it a shot. In one breath, I can definitely give it to the body on this one because this is easily one of their most experimental records yet, with all of this extra arranged instrumentation, some very cool, epic female vocals, some cleans on here that are kind of hellish and interesting and dramatic. But at the core of a lot of these tracks, you still kind of hear the same blown out beats, apocalyptically distorted guitars and bass and whatnot, and those blood-curdling screamed vocals, the that just like give me this intense sense of anxiety that it just sort of sounds like somebody who's trapped in a fucking dungeon and I want to save them. And I mean, these elements have been the bread and butter of many a body album prior, and on some of their early stuff it was really thrilling, it was really exciting, but at this point I feel like it's gotten stale. It's been stale for a few records now, and I feel like that's no less the case on this new one over here. I mean, again, sure, with these vocal and instrumental additions, things are a bit more interesting than they've been in the past. And I also do give them credit for being as out there as they are on the new collaboration that they did with Full of Hell. Typically, I do hear some pretty interesting and experimental ideas on a body album, but again, these core elements that I just talked about, there's not a whole lot to them. They're not very dynamic, and I feel like they add a lot of lulls to the band's newer records because these sounds I feel like have been completely explored by them. There's not much they can add to a record with this handful of very limited, very distorted, very abrasive sounds that they haven't added to their previous projects. It just feels like deja vu. It just feels like a lack of imagination. I've never been a huge Y Oak fan, but I do give the duo credit because I think this transition that they've made from this really slow, dejected indie rock into more of a bass guitar and synthesizer-based sound has led to a lot of good qualities. I think their songs are a bit more lively, a bit catchier, a bit more vibrant. Still, their sound and their delivery, in my opinion, leaves a lot to be desired, but I feel like this new direction gives me and maybe other people a reason to give them another shot if you've never been crazy about their music before, because in a way, they sound like an all-new band. Still not a new band that's blowing me away or anything, but still a new band with a new, great direction. As much as I enjoy a lot of early Kool Keith, as much as I enjoy the first Dr. Octagon record, and as much as I appreciate that album for being the mark on hip-hop that it is, especially inspiring artists like MF Doom, I don't think it's controversial to say that with the project's comeback on this new album over here, it's just kind of a, if you don't use it, you lose it type situation. And not that Kool Keith has been on a hiatus since Dr. Octagon's first record, certainly not the case. But clearly, with the years in between that first record and now, something has gone missing, because this is not nearly as exciting or eccentric or as off the wall or as ballsy, I think, as that first record. And maybe it has something to do with context too. Like, does Dr. Octagon sound? Because I do think they try their best to stick to it as hard and as, I guess, closely as possible. Does their sound make as much sense in 2018 as it did back in 1996? Probably not. The hardcore fans are most likely going to go nuts for it, but with as much time as it's been since the last record, I would have hoped for something that sounded a bit more revitalized. In terms of like quality of material, this almost feels like a step down. Not only is it just lacking in anything new and exciting, but also just, you know, side-by-side comparison, Pepsi challenge, one tastes much better. So this band landed in my lap by way of a recommendation that somebody threw me on a live stream, and I was pretty impressed on my first listen. I mean, there are elements of the Strokes in this band's record. There are elements of that kind of obscure lo-fi indie rock band Women in this band's record. It's kind of noisy, it's kind of catchy. There's a gutsy quality to the performances on this record. The vocals come off a bit generic, and overall their sound is a little dime a dozen when it comes to the lo-fi indie set, but still, I think there's some good tunes on here. And if the band continues and sort of works toward doing something a bit more unique aesthetically, I think this could be a group worth watching into the future. So again, if you're looking for a solid lo-fi-ish indie rock record with some good tunes, give this thing a shot. SCARLXRD is an artist who I've been watching for a little bit now. He's one of the biggest things coming out of the UK in terms of hip-hop right now. And he has a style that is all his own, that is like this fusion of nu metal and screamo and trap. Sure, you could say artists like XXXTentacion and a lot of other artists in the SoundCloud set are also doing something similar. They are. But I feel like SCARLXRD brings up those metal and metalcore influences, those screamo influences so much better than a lot of his other contemporaries do. I also think there's an animalistic, a primal intensity to his performances on these songs, the screaming, the wah, wah, wah. The problem is, as a record though, when you hear all of these songs back to back to back to back, there's clearly a very plain formula and gimmick to what he's doing. And it's very, very edgy, and it's not as deep as it could be. I mean, certainly there are some tracks on here that feel like a commentary on how dark and shitty and despondent the world is. But outside of that, it's almost like you're kind of hearing the same beats, the same flows, the same delivery on every single track. SCARLXRD, as unique as he sounds when you first happen upon him, he is a bit of a one-trick pony. That's not to say that he doesn't have great ideas though, and that he's also not just kind of a product of the music landscape that he's coming out of. But I feel like going forward, if he's going to maintain his audience and also gain new listeners, he's gonna have to change his sound. He's gonna have to diversify somehow, or else he's just gonna be known as the guy who sounds like this, only sounds like this, and there's only going to be a certain amount of shelf life where this kind of thing is marketable, where this kind of thing makes sense. Shout out to CARNAGE over here. He's a producer, new record out, a lot of good, solid features on it. Excellent one from Mac Miller, excellent one from Lil B on here, excellent one from Lil Pump. That I Shine track that I love so much is on here. There's some great features on this thing. A lot like that latest record from Ronnie J. It just sort of seems like CARNAGE is trying to keep up with the Joneses in the trap and the auto-croon scene at the moment. His production is super freaking heavy, super bass-centric. While there are some features on here that shine out more than others, I won't say there's anything on here that really ruined the record. And it feels like most of the time, with this type of music, the production really does steal the show, and he does have some very good beats on here, I will say. The way he EQs and mixes sounds, everything is so loud, everything is so vibrant, everything is so in your face. Some of the more mellow and melodic cuts on here, though, don't quite make as much sense with his hyper-aggressive production style. They also kind of lead to some underwhelming spots on the record. Still, though, I do think it's one of the more solid producer-curated records that I've heard in a while, and if you're in the mood for some bangers, certainly give it a shot. Zishin, and that's it for this edition of the Why You Know Review. Have you listened to any of these albums? Did you love them? Did you hate them? What would you rate them? You're the best, you're the best. What should I review next? Hit the like if you like, please subscribe, and please don't cry. Hit the bell as well. Over here next to my head is another video you can check out. Check that out, or the link to subscribe to the channel. Anthony Fantano, forever.